Le petit retard. Donc, bienvenue à cette session.
Sorry for this little delay. Welcome to this session about the prolonged, the extended treatment. It will be co-managed with Roger Weiss, that you all know, who you all know, and we will start with our first keynote speaker. There are some presentations which will be online. ATHS-2025, David Olignon, who will speak in real, myself. I'm in Biarritz also, Nicolas LINTZERIS, and Kenneth LEE from London, Canada, who will be online. So let's get started with Alice DESCHENAU, please.
Docteur Alice DESCHENAU, je suis psychiatre et chef du service
Alice DESCHENAU, psychiatrist at the Fondation Vallée in southern district of Paris. I have the pleasure to present you, unfortunately, even if it is online, this study of Aubanon. I will open my PowerPoint. So OPALE, this French retrospective survey trying to evaluate the retention rate of Buvidal after 6 months and other efficiency criteria, as well as the satisfaction survey. This declaration of interest disclosure statement since 5 years. I give conferences in Hospitality Bouchara, Recordati, Camurus and Gilit, as well as counseling activities with Camurus. As an introduction, some data about these treatments. Well, we could say in 2023 the number of people benefiting from these treatments, 155,000 people. Methadone and buprenorphine, high doses buprenorphine. Men were the main beneficiaries, and the majority aged of more than 45 years. In 2022, according to available data, 20% of users of CSAPA received a OAT, and more than half are following this treatment for more than 5 years, 7.4% since less than 1 year. As for the arrested, medically managed to take an OAT was 6.7% of patients. That means 11,000 people. Prescription of Buvidal is increasing in the CSAPA, in the medical centers, hospitals and prisons. In 2023, 600 patients, out of them 100 benefited from a Buvidal prescription. In 2019, 87%, depending on opioids, benefited from this treatment in France. Methodology of the OPALE study, a retrospective multicentric survey, and data were collected from medical records of patients. The participants had to be majors, opioid dependent. They didn't have to have participated to any OPALE 1B, and having received at least once the BAP between July 2021 and August 2023. The main target was the retention rate after 6 months, with secondary objectives including different items, factors, these qualitative feedbacks of users, as well as data about satisfaction of participants. Changes in the use of substances and wrong use or misuse of drugs, as well as changes in health and socio-economic situation. This survey was sponsored by Camurus. Here are the main features of population. We could include 101 participants. Sorry, because there are the sound is being chunked sometimes. At the end of the period of the study, 600 people on treatment. About the whole population in France, which is very interesting. The profiles, as you can see, with an average age of 44 years old, 73 men, that means 72.3%, with present comorbidity higher than 1. Most of included patients were receiving this agonist treatment at 98%, and there were people that were treated with methadone at a rate of 5 to 1%. It was on average. As for initial treatment administered, 2/3 received a weekly dose and a therapeutic regime that progressively shows that the main dose was a monthly one, with only 5% of people who remained on a weekly dosage. For what concerns characteristics of patients, population and presentation with the method of the survey, there was a first paper published this summer, and as for the results I present, they are not being published yet, and I hope that you will retrieve them soon. The main objective was the retention rate after 6 months, to follow the patients under treatment through time, and we could obtain then a response rate with 74 people under treatment and 73.3% of retention after 6 months. And on the curve, you can see that in the first 2 months, there is the more significant percentage of dropout. As participants mentioned, in the medical records, they are in the right part of the slide. The notion of personal decisions, we can retrieve other data, such as 4 people talking of a lack of efficiency, side effects, 3 people who were missing afterwards, and 2 people who wished to stop any treatment. One was put in jail, and one that reported side effects, and another one, a last one, personal decision plus side effects and lack of efficiency. The associated factors to retention. Through that work, we looked for some variables that could influence the results and the maintenance in the retention of treatment, in particular usages of drug usages, the comorbidity profiles, socio-demographic characteristics, modes of treatment, the doses. Well, I swept all these things, and we kept those for which we had stats that could lead to understand that there were differences between those who followed the treatment and those who didn't. And these first factors, well, we put them in a multivariate regression model to look whether in a significant way we had variables regarding the pursuit of the treatment in a prolonged way. And these factors, you have the number of psychiatric comorbidities, the initial posology scheme. Was there a difference between the monthly and weekly treatments, and if it was prescribed or not, tobacco consumption and the induction, as well as opioid consumption, as well as prescribed opioids, cocaine use also. And here we have some stats that at the end of the day tell us that for tobacco consumption at induction with patients who were in a better mood than those who didn't pursue the treatment. The question is whether tobacco can be efficient on some pharmacologist handling. Can it interfere as an indirect factor? We do not have the answer to this question, and we were a bit surprised by this factor. And there is still tobacco, so an item that will require future exploration. Maybe other surveys will allow us to understand which could work with tobacco addiction. Finally, the right, as for correlation, was there a link between the last dose of BAP and the maintenance and the treatment, so retention, sufficiently high doses to feel the effects of treatment, but we didn't find any significant relationship between the received dose and the continuation of the treatment after 6 months. Another important aspect to analyze these records was looking at the elements that we could find about the perceived benefits by participants. So there are the data of the records, the command in question of change, which allows to analyze the benefits after a therapeutical change. So to remove, to look through some analyzed elements. As for opioid use, whether they are illicit or prescribed, 80% of the participants saw an augmentation of the use, 5% of people, no changes for 5%, and decrease 80%. As for the perceived changes in the use of opioids with the scale, you can see that 2/3 of people noticed a major change, 1/3 a slight change, and a lack of changes 1.4%. With distancing vis-à-vis dependence, so with the lack of daily treatment, in any case, 90% described this, as well as changes in craving, a moment very important to us for the efficiency of the treatment. 91.9% of people felt positive things regarding the previous treatment. About the changes in consumption of illicit drugs, it was more mitigated. For some there was a decrease, for others there was no changes. So it didn't seem there was a direct impact at that level. But here we would need more advanced works. There might be some profile bias. As for the changes in life sectors, the feedback in general are positive. It was a notion which was not applicable for 55% of people, whilst for others there were twice between those who worked with the changes. Sorry, sometimes for the translation, because the reporter has no mic just in front of her mouth, and a bit complicated sometimes. Well, and in other sectors, there are changes described in the relations at 69% of participants, and for leisure, reaching 63% changes in leisure expenditure, leisure times. Okay. Conclusions. Vis-à-vis this work, let me remind you that we are in a context of unbalanced access to this treatment. Of course, there are financial threats, because it is difficult to have dedicated envelopes that would allow to fund these treatments. It was not the case before. Difficulties of unequal access on the territory for this therapy. There is the importance of studies in real life in terms of satisfaction of users, of the perceived benefits within global clinical approach, which is also psychological, social, and about medical and economic reality. First, data, multicentric data at the national level, and there is the interest of patients that we can notice, that we can underline for the formulation of the questionnaires, the forms, and there was no any emergence of profiles to target this clinical approach as for health and life quality that will concern toxicology and the social situation, with the possibility of bringing medical economic elements as for the initial budgetary expenses with treatments and short-term benefits for global health of people involved. These are the first national multicentric data that show the interest of patients for the formulation of prolonged action, extended action. with high cost regarding other retention schemes. There is this maintenance on the treatment. We could think that treatment can fit to several profiles and that maybe it was not, we didn't need to target these very specific profiles. So far, we think that we can talk about this with the patients as a therapeutic option. I thank you. I thank you for your attention, and I have the pleasure to leave you the whole participants and thank all the researchers who contributed to this work. We read them. I want to thank also the organizing committee for your invitation, ATHS team, Marc AURIACOMBE, who dynamizes, who chairs some round tables. I hope to be soon with you for your questions. Thank you very much.
Très bien, merci Alice.
Very well. Thank you very much, Alice. I don't know if she's still online. Do we have any questions for her? Since we are slightly late, running late. Alice is here on screen. Hi, Alice. And Dr. Lee is here. He's going to speak for the last presentation. Do we have any questions for Alice DESCHENAU about this retrospective study with first patients treated in France? Yes, I see a hand raised for a question in the front row. We need a microphone so that Alice can hear the question. Yes, indeed. Hello, my question is a simple one and may seem stupid, but I'd like you to develop OAT in English. Could you tell me what the acronym stands for? So I hope it's not treatment of addiction to opioids. No, agonist treatment. It's an... I don't know if you can hear me, says Alice. We don't. Alice says she doesn't get any sound. I'll try again. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you.
Je suis désolée, j'essaye de parler, mais je crois que vous ne m'entendez pas du tout.
Yes, we can hear you, Alice.
Ça a marché ou si c'est mort, et du coup on ne saura pas.
So I wrote it on my phone, says Alice. Can you call me, Alice? You want to call me? Yes, please.
Vas-y.
Okay, go ahead, Alice. Yes, I wrote you a word. So it's the A stands for agonist. The agonist treatment of opioids.
Traitement agoniste opiacé. Okay, autre question.
Okay, very well. Do we have any other question? Thank you.
Alors, j'ai pas entendu la question.
I didn't hear the question. Maybe I'm going to ask in the meantime.
The question is in English. I'm not sure, Alice, if you can hear or understand. So, did I understand the presentation, the findings correctly? That when you looked at all the potential predictors, comorbidities, cravings, substance use, all those things, that the only variable which was predictive of retention was tobacco use?
Oui, du coup, Marc, je te réponds. Je ne sais pas si vous m'entendez.
Yes, I'm going to answer in English. I don't know if you can hear me. So, indeed, your microphone is on, so I can hang up. Okay, this is exactly it on this group, and in a retrospective manner, these are the limits in our work. Indeed, to our surprise, it's the tobacco element that came out only. And I have no further explanation for the moment. Maybe for other studies, we will discover other elements potentially, but for the moment, that is the only one that was significant when we looked at all the statistics.
Possibly that's just a power issue, that you've only got 24 dropouts. So it'd be hard to, in a regression model, to find factors with such small numbers. So maybe this is just a power problem.
Yes.
Tout à fait.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So one last question. Dr. Michel, I followed all of the buprenorphine with treatment, and we have been using something that I never see in the studies. We are in association, so we are helped to obtain the treatment, but I think we're not really part of the studies. But it's a pity because we do have another bias, a different bias, to receive them. And what I wanted to do is to know how we could take contact with you, get in contact with you, because I never see this in the seminar or hear it, but we have the same results of you found for the advantages of buprenorphine. It's so with the presentations of the new treatment and all the uses, it's important for them to know that it exists. Otherwise, because we may have more demand, there are consultations and 20 people asked us for buprenorphine. So I'd like to know how we could be part of your study or have access to your studies more easily. For the first one, I think it was impossible. We had to, I think for the second part, maybe it's easier. So OPALE 1 is a study we did in our patients. OPALE 2 was done, as I reminded, with 13 centers included in hospitals and a majority, so in hospitals, but not all. And then maybe, so this study is over, but you are right to mention your interest for other work. I don't know if Marc is still there, because the OBAP is, there's an ongoing study. I don't have any knowledge of any other current work undergone, but indeed, it's important for you to say you're interested and you'd like to take part. So we don't have any budget that we can allocate to this. So this is why we will have to stop at some point, because the hospital gives us some funding, but it's not always reproducible or duplicable. So this is why we'll have a treatment that will come to an end. So that's a fundamental issue in our current system. And I totally agree with you, because I think it's the 5th year we're on reusable credit, and it's reassessed every year with funding that's important. In the beginning, we were lucky, but it hasn't gone down for the moment or reduced. But we are all in a situation on the level of these psychosocial entities that are very precarious. We have no visibility on the next steps. And I'd like to say that it would be awful to have patients without treatment, but since nothing is secured and or prolonged, we are expecting further validation of the budget every year. This is something we look closely. It's not satisfactory, but we need to inform the health directors, and we have a solid basis, and this is what we see in France for this aim to show proof of the interest to insensitize this. And this is why there are studies still, and we need to inform the departmental entities, local entities, and we had great feedback from users, and I think we need to make it available to them. Thank you very much, Alice. Thank you all for these questions. We have little time, so we're going to move on to the next presentation by David Audin, with an expert patient based in Mont-de-Marsan. Many people know him in the addictology field, and the presentation is called Your Knowledge and Our Experience. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I had made a first part for my presentation, but I'm very honored to be with you today. And I'm not a researcher, pharmacist, or doctor. I'm not an expert. I am an expert patient in addiction. So what I'd like to share with you are not data or curves. These are moments in life, real realities experienced, and what I heard in Bayonne. So we're not very far from there, from a group of people concerned that are recovering. My story, my name is David Audin, and for 10 years I suffered from polyaddictions. I, my wife, my children, my friends, my work colleagues, everyone, tobacco, alcohol, medication, everything. 10 years of hell and 14 withdrawals I had to test, and I spent 360 days in psychiatric hospitals in the Southwest. I discovered them all. I can tell you where the food is good and not. So it's a decade in which I didn't feel alive. I was just surviving. I was playing a role. I was pretending to smile, to be happy, and I was alone in my interior fight that even my close relatives didn't understand. I thought I was dead. Nobody believed in me anymore. But today, more than 7 years, I haven't been using any drugs, and this is a personal choice. More than 7 years that I took my life into my own hands, and I understood something essential. What we experience, we can use. And I decided to change my path into a strength to move to the other side and become what we call a patient expert in certified addiction, or certified patient. So I work with the Mont-de-Marsan Hospital, and I am part of the team, this cross-disciplinary team. What is an expert patient? A role, a posture, a responsibility? And I cannot talk about our association without quoting Michel Renaud. I didn't have the chance to meet him, but we wouldn't be here without him. What does it mean, being an expert patient? It's not just coming to talk about your life. It's being trained, having a framework, and recognized in a certain role, a bridge between users, concerned people, and caregivers. We talk about bilingualism. We speak both languages, that of patients that we are always, and that of the caregivers, and we can translate when necessary. I followed the co-certification APHB-SBAEA, and demanding training with health professionals. 1 year training with hindsight on the pathology, to be able to support people and to bring about change for them. At the end, we talk in front of a jury to obtain a certification. I'd like to take advantage to say that we have a booth. We're present at the symposium, so if you wish to come and help us, talk to us, we are looking for other health professionals to build our team. So we want to understand the complexity of the pathways, experiences, have an ethical framework, and recognize our limitations. We also learn that our experience and know-how is a real competence, and that, well used, it can change somebody's experience, somebody who is experiencing difficult times. This training is based on 7 skills or competences that you have here on this slide. First, knowing how to share your experience in a useful way, not just to talk about yourself, but to make it echo in someone else. Know how to listen with a real presence without wanting to repair or give advice. I always come back to what Byron said. If you want to advise something, follow it yourself. And so for addictions, it's just as if, okay, Eureka, I found it, it's all going to go well. But we need to learn, and it's through training that it's possible, and that we realize that there are different paths, not just one path to follow. Understanding addiction, knowing that it's a biological, psychic, social disease, by respecting everybody's role. We are not caregivers or health practitioners, we are just an additional tool. Holding the cape that is relational and clear, we're not therapeutics, we're peers. We are sitting by the person's side and adopting a reflexive posture, stepping in the shoes of the person, understanding their emotions. And a friend of mine said that the right distance is having no distance, but we need to reassess it at every second and take action to help users, to give them a power to act so that they become actors in their own lives. This is a true job or activity, but it is a huge social utility or usefulness. So I have been welcomed at the XAPA in Bayonne that you all know here, the CSAPA, and I'd like to tell you about this incredible experience that proved already, well, the head is Dr. Daloued. He has a humanity in his approach and a new vision. I really discovered him because for the work that I needed to do, I needed to talk to people, to understand, and I received a yes, an answer, positive answer. So receiving someone who is not a health professional or caregiver, I thought that was quite amazing. And I'd like to thank Thibault, who also supported me and supervised these discussions, and I'm going to tell you more about it. Users decided to use a specific substitution. They used the BAF, and what I heard that day, so I'm not going to forget. The BAF, for those who don't know it, is a substitutional program with opioids that you don't take every day. It's a technology that liberates the substance progressively in the body, and it changes everything. What I heard from patients is a relief, a deep relief, reconquering their time, their dignity, and their own image. They said, one person told me it was incredible. Before I was surviving between 2 shoots, and today I live between 2 appointments. Another person told me not having to think about this daily dose. We are patients, we are not pharmacists. And it's true that sometimes we are asked to manage it all, and it's quite complicated. Another person said, I am no longer a slave of my treatment. This person told me that in the morning she got up in a state that was impossible to accept, and she had to find her medicine, packets of medicine, and it took her hours to find herself in an acceptable state. Imagine 3 hours in the morning, it's half a day for years. And from one day to the next, she was able to have her mornings to herself. So another person said, I can finally work on something else. Since just like on my psychological suffering. So it's also saving time. Somebody said, everything was explained to me, and I felt considered and not treated as a child. This touched me greatly because, you know, when you're in a difficult situation, we feel like children, we're considered as children. And the fact of having people talk to you, you grow back into your adult state and you're faced with your responsibilities. And somebody said, I don't feel judged any longer at the pharmacy, no longer boxes of medications, packets at home. They can't see I was a former addict. These testimonials show the strength of this use of medication and more room to rebuild themselves. What I heard are not these pharmacological use. It's a change of paradigm. We were no longer in an imposed treatment, but in a partnership for a therapy, an alliance between the patient and the physician. And it's a lever to rebuild, to reconstruct yourself. A fact to be able to feel free, see the future, feel dignified, and be able to travel. Somebody said she could have never imagined being able to travel again. This is essential in addiction. What the disease attacks first and foremost is self-esteem. A sentence that summarizes it all that I'd like to share with you. You are doctors and researchers. You have the molecules. We have the stories. And together we can find solutions. I think that it's all there. We cannot move forward without scientists or doctors. We cannot achieve our results. Your knowledge, our experience are the two sides of the same coins, and both are essential. And with this function that you get an expert patient. So thank you for giving voice to room for our voices. And it opens the way to these patients now. It's not always obvious. Sometimes people look at us in a defiant way, but if I'm here today, it's not to talk in the place of patients, but it's to have this collective voice, share experience, science in a more human and efficient way. So in conclusion, my name is David Devion, and I was very sick, and today I'm a patient expert or expert patient, and my message to you is let's listen to everyone, not lose one voice, and make of treatments a human adventure. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Mr. de Lyon. We have time for a few questions. Yes, I see a hand raised and a microphone on its way.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your sharing and for the work that you're doing. This is, I'm sure you're familiar, this is very reminiscent of the peer recovery coach programs in the United States that have become quite powerful and very useful in programs throughout the country. And certainly we employ, I think, dozens of peer recovery coaches throughout our health system now. My question to you is, I'm curious as to your thoughts about the role of choice in your use when you were living those 10 years.
Can you repeat the question, Eric?
I'm curious to know your thoughts about the role of choice, about your choosing or not the use that you did during those 10 years, and how much of that was you would attribute. In other words, would you say, I felt powerless, I had no choice? I felt like I did have some choice. I felt like I had a lot of choice. Where does it fall along that visual analog scale, if you would? Thank you. Is that clear?
La question, c'est
the question was, during this period of consumption, drug use, what was the part of choice you had in front of you? And with the hindsight, do you think that when at some point you had choices you could make, one choice, no choice, several choices? I think that I was completely lost, in fact. And so the products that could decrease my suffering and help me live in this world, I had an incredible choice. But when I saw that issues were too big, I had to do something. And these are the discussions with the health practitioners, and we discussed to know how to get out of it. It was a long path to travel because I was never sure of anything, and it was about how we could do things. And I knew benzodiazepine, mood regulators, and others, but I couldn't find the right solution. So, and what lacked was my implication. People gave me, lent me a strategy or tried to, and as you know, what I said, they know, they're going to work, and I didn't get really involved in it. I wasn't committed, and it's so true. It's just a question of, with one professional, health professional, we understood one another, and we started an approach, and I was just as involved that she was.
Thank you.
Autre question?
Any other question? Otherwise, before giving the floor to Roger Weiss, I'm going to stand up to suggest to make the next announcement. So we will be talking about prolonged action of buprenorphine with the OBAP. It's a study implemented by the University of Bordeaux. So prolonged action of buprenorphine, BAP. We know there are potential expectations that may be important, since for patients already treated and experiencing a relapse or withdrawal, rather, for 10 years, it was to facilitate the treatment with people and where the treatment was only accessible with a daily deliverance of the product with doses, takeaway doses, and looking for comfort. So it's nothing trivial, because we saw that it's a long-term treatment and that the fatigue of the patient may push him to want to stop at an early stage, and we need to maintain the use of the product, and because the consequences could be high. But what we saw is that the idea for patients with a buprenorphine treatment who do not answer, or with a partial remission or insufficient remission, that there's a supervision in self-management. We could imagine that in this case, prolonged action of buprenorphine could help a non-responder patient to come back to one that would respond. So we saw that with OPALE 2, presented by Alice DESCHENAU, that when we look at the consecutive tests with patients treated, we have results that are extremely interesting and encouraging as well, and they indicate that it may have an impact. But these data are retrospective, and as any retrospective data, it's good to be able to reproduce them afterwards. So the aim of the study implemented by the University of Bordeaux is an observatory of prolonged action of buprenorphine, and to examine in the French context. So in Europe, it's very specific, because we have buprenorphine. We offer it as a treatment to opioid addictions, and have been for a long time. And the accessibility is supple, since each practitioner decides with their patient about the context and constraints of the treatment. So we don't have, as in other countries, this constraint of the ways, instructions to deliver the product, and it's easier. So it's important to look at the very context of each country and to see it in a perspective manner. This study was the object, through the intermediary of the Aquitaine Santé Agency, Santé Transfer Agency, the agency associated to the university that manages contracts with industrialists, and the Camerus company has provided funding used by the University of Bordeaux. So it has been declared, and the protocol is available. So the design of the study is quite simple. It's an observational prospective study. It's still ongoing, and you'll have a QR code for those who would not have participated. You will be welcome to take a look, and it included adults, including if they're imprisoned. And starting from a basic assessment, before the start of the treatment, we have a vision on the last 30 days or all of life of the patient, and specifically the last 30 days before the start of the treatment. The people are followed prospectively for 6 months, and then we assess the evolution of their pathway. One of the originalities of this study is that it's a national recruitment in the territory, but everything is remote. It's done remotely. So the start is done with a prescriber who, at some point, says he will prescribe the treatment to a patient. Then he or she contacts the OPALE team, and then, after having seen with the patient to give his information, the patient is contacted and the study is presented to him. There's a discussion to see whether the patient is interested or not. Yes or no, we'll stop at that, or not. Yes, I'm interested. So then there's a deeper examination in order to look at the inclusion-exclusion criteria. And if the patient can be included, he'll sign a paper to be part of the study. Then there's a basic assessment, and the first take of buprenorphine or BA, and then assessment after 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and 6 months. So in the tools to collect the information, so the ADDICT or Addiction Severity Index, we collect information, objective information, such as substances used, the number of uses, and also experiences that are subjective. The perception by the person, whether it's he or she is using, is it problematic for the person or not? If, when it comes to the treatment, is the person satisfied, or do they have the feeling they need more, etc.? So there's also an assessment of people, with all people who could be affected by addiction, touched by addiction, financial resources, medical condition, use substances, behavior, family, social, legal situation, psychological state. So we look at the quality of life, and then in this index also, beyond the specific information that we can document, the consumption of opioids, but also alcohol, tobacco, screens, generate scores that have been created or designed in order to compare the evolutions for a same patient in time and between different different patients, and composite scores that combine objective data of consumption, but also the person's perception of his or her situation, and if it's problematic, then a severity score that is more made for the clinic and assess the need for a treatment. So in the framework of this, we program different interviews, and we ask for the person's consent. It is planned to find the right time to look how we are going to develop this in time. If a patient prefers to do this in 1 hour, others want to spread it along a day or several days, or they want to divide it. So there's the DSM criteria. TSR is the consumption of other services. So on top of the prescriber, do they benefit from any other treatment? And the scale of self-assessment of quality of life, a urinary sample for those who wish to do it, and they send it remotely through the post, imagine. And that's it. So currently 73 centers or teams, prescriber teams, who are taking part. And as you see, they are spread out throughout the entire French territory, including in overseas territory, Martinique. The first inclusion was made in the observatory in March 2023. Since then, 361 topics were highlighted by patients. Among these these people, we have been able to contact 290 people, and among these 290 that were screened, 225 were eligible to be included, and 190 were finally included and signed their consent to be part of the study. So 2/3 of women, 42 years in average, and most of them had already had a treatment. 90% already were under treatment, 10% without treatment, and most of them had buprenorphine treatment, some methadone, and others naloxone. For your information, because these figures are not stabilized yet, but at the start, as you know, in France, is only available for practice the Buvidal, so as buprenorphine with a prolonged action, and the average dose for the first injection is 103 milligrams. The second injection, 112, then 211, and during the third injection, since this is when we both... So, the aim in the objective, what we wanted to look at, the first assumption was people in remission wouldn't be improved or would remain stable, rather. And on the other hand, people who, in the beginning of the treatment, while implementing the BAP, were not in remission, for those, they would see an improvement that would be significant and eventually would move to remission, or at least had a net improvement for the composite score. For the composite score that includes consumption of opioids. And here, if we look globally at the remission in literature and data that we have available in the framework of ADDICTOLOGIE, we had a threshold that we studied from 0 or 25, and beyond which people are considered not being in remission. Globally, between M0 and M3, there are 65% of improvement. So the group saw an improvement with this indicator. And if we look at people who were not in remission, we notice that those not in remission saw an improvement, and that in the very first month maintained the improvement, and then moved from status to non-respondent to respondent. So this is an improvement that is associated to a change, in terms of response to the treatment, which is important. And more surprisingly, people who were considered by their physicist and with the data of the ASI as in remission, access to the treatment, in quote, for comfort, improved their situation and improved it even more so than those who, from a qualitative standard, moved from non-remission to remission, and they improved their situation in the first month. This improvement was maintained and consolidated in time. If we look at the severity scores, the results are comparable by knowing that the severity scores are less for this type, made for less for this type of comparison. But if we look at the use of drugs for the group who wasn't in remission, the group who had the highest consumption of opioids, so they considerably improved their situation and reduced the use, and the group in remission who had a slight consumption as opioids or heroin, rarely, but use of medication with, well, they reduced the use. If we look at beyond these indicators, the craving, of course, other highlights, what we saw is that if the number of participants, the number of days when people experimented the craving decreased with opioids, 90% of people said that they had a decrease of the cravings. For those who the craving didn't decrease, they reported the number of days of craving. So on the other hand, when they experienced craving, they remained at the same level. Otherwise, if we take a look at addictions or other uses and associated addictions, either to look for an indirect impact or to see a transfer of addiction, if people are constrained by a molecule to consume opioids, do they move on to alcohol or other substances, tobacco, alcohol? For the participants in remission who were okay in other fields, no change, but those not in remission during the remission improved their situation in terms of alcohol, relation to tobacco, and gaming, since the composite score improved by 23, 47, and 66%, and those who, for the use, the number of days of use of cannabis, cocaine, sedatives, and the practice of gaming decreased. So we see an improvement on opioids, consumption of opiates, but more generally on addictive behaviors, and no shift from this point of view. And if we look at the quality of life for the rest of the study, we see that for family, social relationships, psychological state, individual provide, for those, we don't see those, it was already good for those, so no change.
So in total, these are the results that were collected prospectively, with very little drop-offs through time, and with direct contact with the patients and those who were involved to confirm, actually, and this shows, as many other studies in the world, this shows that, well, this treatment is used in other areas in the world, and even in the French context, where there is no need to access long-acting buprenorphine to have a treatment, because you can receive this prescription if it's suitable. So we estimate that most patients can have access to this treatment, but now this access is even wider. Now, if you want to participate in this study, for those who were not part of OPALE 2, you can scan the QR code and you can also join us via email and telephone at the number that you can see here on the screen. So now when you think of a patient, sometimes, well, you can send a message via email or the phone and maybe just put us in touch with that person, and that person will be contacted so that we can collect information so that this is not an obstacle to implement treatment, because sometimes, of course, well, you need to do that without delay. I would like to thank all the team, because this is almost a work of engineering. These are all the people who make the study go on. And there's especially Jean-Marc Alexandre, who's the person in touch with the field. And then there are all the people collecting data. Thank you very much.
We have time for some questions. I have one question.
Yes.
You have many years of experience with sublingual buprenorphine, less experience with injectable. From your experience, what are you seeing that's similar versus different?
Well, non. Alors, la différence dans...
So the difference, I would say that the difference is for the non-compliant patients, because in the French context, you can deliver daily, you can deliver at the pharmacy, you can have take-home doses. This is easy. I mean, there is this access that is available, but there are a certain number of patients who interrupt the treatment. And the medical team where I work wanted to provide a long-acting buprenorphine for those difficult patients who are going to come in, but we don't know when they're going to come in again. We don't know when we're going to see them again. And this is the moment. And here we've had certain cases where the person, there's two situations. It's either the person has come again repeatedly because they're in abstinence and they're craving, and then they're requesting the care, or the person disappears and then comes back 15 days later or a month later, and that person is transformed and is doing much better. And then you give them the second injection. So I would say that this is especially for patients, and actually long-acting treatments, they are, to put it positively, it's for those patients where the constraint of having a daily treatment to get is a burden. And those patients who will not immediately benefit from the therapeutic effects, because they have to do all this other stuff like getting housing, getting food, getting everything. So taking tablets on top of this or taking a treatment, well, this is too much, overwhelming for them.
Right, time is running.
Are there other questions that people have? Yes.
Marc. Our experience, so we have probably about 600 patients on buprenorphine action prolongée, and being on call for the service, the call that we get most often is this patient is 1 week late, 2 weeks late, 3 weeks late, or wants to come in a day early, a week early. And, probably the biggest challenge is to support the clinicians to make good decisions and not say, no, the patient's come in at the wrong time, come back another time or something like that. What's your experience with this? Because, the medication doesn't work strictly from 5 to 9 days or 3 to 5 weeks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Donc oui, ça c'est une question importante. Donc on le voit dans le cadre
this is a very important issue. We see that in the framework of COPAC, there's a change in terms of the practice because OBAB, the Observatory of Long-Acting Buprenorphine, is not a place where we tell people how to do. What we see is that at the beginning there's more use of buprenorphine, and I have to say that in France there's only Buvidal, okay? So this is the weekly or the monthly buprenorphine with different doses, all right? But what we see with time is that people use the weekly dose for a month or even longer than that. And now we see that people are starting with a monthly format and then they use higher doses. So I think that this is a trend. I mean, we still need to see the detail, but this is the kind of trend, the practices that we see. I mean, people are kind of owning all this practice.
Thank you very much.
Une question au premier rang.
Oh, did you have a question?
Yeah, there's a question in the first row, I believe.
Oui, merci Marc.
Yes, thank you, Marc. Quickly, one of the most striking things for us when long-acting buprenorphine was introduced is that, what the patients reported, we saw that sublingual tablets, daily treatments, these treatments are very conditioning for the patients. And then what the patients report is that when they wake up, it's uncomfortable. They have to wait to take the tablet and for the tablet to make an effect. And then they go from, they have ups and downs and they go from highs to lows and with those tablets. And actually, now we want to observe some plasma rates that are stable. So there's this dimension of deconditioning, and this is actually what patients report. They say that they're not conditioned anymore, and they say that they wake up and they're not sick anymore. And this is what allows me to say and to tell health authorities, in order to get funds for this treatment, it's what allows me to say, yeah, it is the same molecule indeed, but it is not the same treatment. I just wanted to give this piece of information to complete what you have said already. Yes, and actually a point about that in the study, of course, there are prescribers and partners who are essential because it is thanks to them that we can provide the treatment, that we can recruit patients, that the observatory can observe people affected. But what's interesting is that everything is dealt by the team, the research team and the patients. I mean, everything revolves around these two, and this is interesting, all right? And of course, it's not extraordinary, but I would like to really insist in that. If you want good research, valuable research, you have to have the right stakeholders there. Thank you.
We have to move on to to your talk. So our next speaker is Dr. Nicolas LINTZERIS from the University of Sydney, where he's a professor of addiction medicine and a very well-known researcher who's going to be talking about withdrawal from long-acting injectable buprenorphine findings from a case series.
Yes, good, thank you. It's always an honor and a real pleasure to come to France, the home of buprenorphine, to talk about buprenorphine. So yet again, it's a pleasure. I'm just going to present a small little case series that we did, looking at the issue of withdrawal from long-acting injectable buprenorphine. And we did this study largely because it's an area which gets little attention in the clinical research field, yet is such an important issue for so many patients. One of the questions that many patients have is, how am I going to get off this and what happens when I get off? Yet this is an area under-researched in the whole area of opioid dependence treatment. So just to acknowledge that this study was an investigator-led study with funding from Cameras, so thank you. We were the sponsor at the district that I work in, went through an ethics committee, and want to acknowledge my colleagues. In particular, we worked closely with an NGO, which is a residential rehabilitation unit called WHOS, which stands for We Help Ourselves. This is a residential rehab where it came out of a group of patients themselves who set up their own service to look at residential rehab many years ago, 30 years ago. And just to say, conflicts of interest, I have received honoraria from both Cameras and Indivior and funding for research. And this paper has been published. Victoria Hayes is the first author, and it's great. She was my registrar almost 20 years ago, and now she's my boss. So that's wonderful when you see your staff progress like that. The background, many of you know this, that we're very good at, we figured out good ways of getting patients into treatment. We put a lot of focus about how we keep patients in treatment, yet we don't do a lot of research about what happens when patients leave treatment. We know that so clinically, our standard practice would be to gradually reduce the dose of the methadone or the sublingual buprenorphine, gradually reduce it, often at a painfully slow rate. Yet unfortunately, it seems to be associated with high rates of relapse, and many studies report over 85% of patients will relapse or resume illicit opiate use within 6 months. Talk to any patients and they'll tell you about the difficulties, especially with methadone, but also with coming off sublingual buprenorphine. And indeed, there was an American researcher, I think from Chicago, Selby, in the 1980s, started looking at this issue of methadone withdrawal, coming off methadone. He actually identified that there was a fear of withdrawal syndrome, and actually developed a fear of methadone withdrawal scale, which we used in this study. So it really highlights that for many patients, the coming off is a major, major barrier. And for some patients, it prevents them entering treatment. And unfortunately, for many patients, treatment is not, the end of treatment is often not planned. It's just patients just drop out, and we don't hear from them or see from them until they come back to the clinic 3, 6 months later, 2 years later. Again, if you do surveys of patients and you ask patients, do you want to be on this medication for the rest of your life? Not many patients say yes to that. The vast majority of patients identify that at some point in time, they want to come off the methadone or the buprenorphine. Yet, very little research has been done in this field. So, the potential of long-acting injectable buprenorphine in withdrawal. You can see just from the pharmacological profile what happens with the long-acting buprenorphine. This is Buvidal. If we had Sublocade up here, it'd be similar, just it would be a longer x-axis. And what we see is a gradual reduction in plasma levels. That happens according to whether or not you're using a weekly or a monthly product for Buvidal or it's a Sublocade. So it's this gradual taper, which to a certain degree mimics what we try to do in the clinic with gradually reducing doses of methadone or sublingual. But picking up on Jean-Pierre's comment, often there's a conditioning that happens when patients are dropping down their dose of methadone or buprenorphine. Some patients become so fearful of the next dose that for many of them, that's enough to cause relapse, even though they're not experiencing withdrawal yet, just the fear of it. Sometimes we've done blind dose reductions where we don't tell the patient what dose they're on. That helps some patients, but it's not really sustainable for most patients. So the idea, the potential here that we saw, that here is a drug that pharmacologically, it's getting its own pharmacological taper, and without then having to worry about the issues of expectancy from the patient of, I'm about to drop my dose and hence I'm about to get withdrawal. And the biggest barrier is that last dose as well. That's when often a lot of patients. So we see some patients are hanging on to, 2.5 milligrams of methadone for 3 months or 0.4 milligrams of Subutex for months and months and months because of a fear of stopping treatment. And clinically, the kinds of questions that our patients were asking was, well, if I stop this injection, when will withdrawal start? How severe is it going to be? How long is it going to last for? And when am I going to get peak symptoms? And we as clinicians are asking the questions, are we going to see better outcomes than what happens when we try to stop methadone or sublingual? So that's the background to this study. The hypothesis was that if we stop long-acting injectable buprenorphine, that it would result in a mild opiate withdrawal syndrome with minimal increases in craving or deteriorations in health. And our primary objective then was to characterize the onset, severity, and duration of opiate withdrawal on stopping a 64 milligram monthly Buvidal dose in patients who are on long-term treatment. So this is not a single dose of Buvidal in a heroin user. These are patients who've been on long-term opiate agonist treatment and at least months of buprenorphine treatment. And we had a range of other secondary outcomes, mood, sleep, cravings, a whole range of things, and you'll see what. Now, we did this in an inpatient or a residential rehabilitation setting where patients could stay 16 weeks as part of the admission. The unit we were working in was a place called WHO's, and they actually have a standalone specific resi rehab component to their program, which is for people coming off methadone or buprenorphine. So they've got one resi rehab unit, which is maintenance doses, so that's for patients to stabilize, but they also have a unit which they help patients to come off. And so we did that study, this study in that unit. So this is a long-term residential rehabilitation. Why did we choose that setting? Because we needed a residential setting where patients where we weren't going to have outcomes confounded by things such as ongoing heroin use or use of other drugs, or just had a fight with my girlfriend and my cravings are going through the roof and I'm going to show her, I'm going to go and use. So all those kinds of things that happen in real world community settings detract from our ability to characterize the nature of the opiate withdrawal syndrome. And that's what this study was about. Not what are the long-term outcomes, are people going to relapse or not relapse? That wasn't this study. This study was to characterize the profile of withdrawal that happens on stopping the Buvidal dose. The participants had to be over 18, had to be in buprenorphine for at least 6 months, and had to be at least 2 months on long-acting injectable buprenorphine. No major severe comorbid health problems at the time, and not withdrawing from other substances. So it was okay if a patient was on a stable dose of diazepam, for example, they could stay on that, but we didn't want anyone withdrawing from other medications at the same time. We did set up the study. We were going to do this as a observational study with a comparison group. We did aim to also recruit patients who are coming off sublingual buprenorphine and admit them to the same unit and do a taper of the sublingual buprenorphine. It was never going to be a randomized trial. It was just going to be two comparison groups. Unfortunately, we were not able to recruit sufficient numbers in the sublingual buprenorphine for us to be able to make much meaning out of it. We've got a few patients, but really ended up being more or less a single group study. We did allow rescue medications. They were limited in the number of doses. The main rescue medication that we allowed was temazepam, a benzodiazepine, but this was restricted to a limited number of occasions over the 16-week period. So patients couldn't just ask for the temazepam every night. They were given, I think from memory, it was 3 or 5 doses of temazepam were allowed over the whole 16-week admission. And then other aspects of care was as per standard practice for the unit. So there was the kinds of things you get in a resi rehab. There was daily support groups, daily activities, weekly meetings, morning meetings, and one-to-one counselling with clients. So it was a supportive environment. Range of scales that we used, the COWS was our main instrument for withdrawal, but we also did include subjective and objective opioid withdrawal scales, the Handelsman scales, partly because the COWS, anyone's used the COWS, it's an amalgam of subjective and objective features, and so it was difficult to separate from the scores how much of this is subjective versus objective. So we wanted to get the two different scales as well. And you can see there some of the other scales we've used as well. We have done actigraphy as well to look at sleep. We haven't got the data back from that yet, though, so I won't be reporting on the sleep outcomes. So we only recruited 2 participants to the sublingual buprenorphine arm. Was discharged against medical advice on the day they reached 0 milligrams of sublingual buprenorphine. So we've got no real withdrawal data for them because, as we know, the peak withdrawal symptoms when you stop sublingual buprenorphine happens in the first week or so after stopping the dose. So we don't really have great data for the sublingual, but you'll see what we got. 25 participants started the study on the Buvidal arm. 10 withdrew before they reached week 4. So that's before their next dose of Buvidal would have been due anyway. So that was like still part of a routine treatment. Why did they leave? They left because of the reasons people leave resi rehabs. You know, my girlfriend wants me, I'm missing my kids. It's a bad, you know, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be coming off. It was a stupid idea. What was I thinking? So those participants were taken out of our data analysis because they didn't even make the 4-week mark when they were due the next dose. So we're going to be focusing on the 15 people that stayed beyond 4 weeks after the last dose of Buvidal. And this is what we saw for the aggregate data. And you can see here it's pretty much flat line. So we barely saw withdrawal symptoms, signs or symptoms throughout the course of the study. You can see there with the COWS, we've got there the sort of the threshold COWS score 6 is considered a mild withdrawal. The average peak withdrawal did not reach mild withdrawal severity on the COWS. And you can see there with the objective and the subjectives, same issue going on, not much in the way of symptoms. The peak symptoms happened around weeks 5 to 8 after the last dose of Buvidal, and thereafter, not much in the way of withdrawal discomfort after that. You can see there the peak COWS. So these graphs are aggregate data. Now, the problem with aggregate data is it sort of flattens out individual variation. So one patient may peak at week 5, someone else is peaking at week 8. The average makes it look like there's nothing much going on. So we were interested to look at individual scores, and you can see there, when we used the COWS, 2/3 of participants did not even, their peak severity COWS score did not even reach the threshold of mild withdrawal on the COWS. And only 1/3 reached mild withdrawal, none reached moderate withdrawal of a score of more than 12. You can see there with the subjective opiate withdrawal scale, again, very similar kinds of findings. With the SALs, pretty much anyone, any score counts as withdrawal. So you can see there the majority was still in that very mild range. Interestingly, the opiate craving scale, and we started to see increasing cravings as time went on. You can see there that by the size of the error bars, huge variation between the participants. So notice the withdrawal was long gone. Withdrawal peaked weeks 5 to 8, but some participants started getting increasing cravings towards the end of their admission, which really highlights that cravings can be linked to withdrawal, but they also can be independent of withdrawal as well. Craving is a dual-headed beast, so to speak. General health, nothing. There was nothing to see. There was no deterioration in mental health. So we used the PROMIS 29. It's got a number of subscales there. There was just no deterioration in the scores for these participants over time. You can see when participants used the temazepam, and that likewise really highlights that the peak discomfort was in that week 5, 6, 7, 8 period. From consumer perspectives, we asked them, we use the TSQM, and you can see pretty high ratings throughout the course of the study from the consumers. And we asked them, compared to prior attempts at stopping, how would you rate this withdrawal attempt to prior attempts? And you can see there, of the 10 participants that answered that on the exit interview, everyone rated it as better. Most of them said it was very much better than before. This is the data for the 2 sublingual participants. I won't get too carried away because there's only 2 of them, but you can see there the withdrawal scores were already higher before they even reached 0. So clinically, our observation is that this is a much milder withdrawal syndrome than what we typically experience when patients are stopping sublingual buprenorphine. So the study's strengths and limitations, it's a small study, 15 participants. So we can talk about generalities, but we're not capturing outliers here. And if you had 100 participants doing this, chances are there'd be some patients who would say it was the withdrawal was dreadful. So there's variation, and we don't have a big enough sample size to be able to pick up those outliers who do experience withdrawal. I'm sure that there will be some patients in your practice who will describe, I stopped the Buvidal and I got bad withdrawal. So we've got limitations of small settings. A strength of the study is that it is a residential unit. That's a strength because it allows us that whatever symptoms we were seeing, it was most likely due to the Buvidal withdrawal and not other stuff going on in the environment. But this is not a real-world examination of the outcomes of what happens when you stop Buvidal treatment in the community. And for that, we ultimately need proper controlled studies in the community looking at people stopping long-acting injectable compared to people stopping their sublingual buprenorphine treatment. So you can see there the questions that our patients were asking. When will withdrawal commence? Well, in the month after your last dose. So when you do your next dose, if you don't get your next dose, then in the few weeks after that, the withdrawal's unlikely to be severe and it's unlikely to be prolonged withdrawal. But as for whether or not outcomes are better, we can't answer that in this study. There are other questions. Why did we stop 64? If a patient, say, was on 128 milligrams, do you need to taper them down to 64 to stop? Intuitively, that tends to be what we do when we do withdrawal. We tend to taper people down as far as we can, but it could well be that if you stop 96 or 128, the withdrawal may be no different to stopping 64. We don't know. We need more research. Should we be considering those patients who are, say, on methadone or sublingual buprenorphine and are thinking, I want to come off, should we be considering that their last few doses of medication, putting them onto a long-acting injectable? Now, one of the barriers of methadone to buprenorphine is that it's hard to do those transfers on high-dose methadone. But in the withdrawal context, where a patient may have brought themselves down to 20 milligrams of methadone, then transferring over to a Buvidal dose is straightforward. It's simple. So this might be something that we start to think about when working with our patients, that if you're looking at stopping, Should your last few doses be a long-acting injectable rather than methadone or sublingual? But ultimately, one of the key things that we need to do is develop better treatment approaches to support patients to be able to successfully stop our treatment without relapsing back into regular use. The other thing, and to do that, I think we should be thinking about how do we harness some of the new technologies available to us, such as telehealth and those kinds of approaches. Getting a patient who's sick and tired of coming into the clinic, which is what they've been doing for the last 5 years on a regular basis, and then telling them to sort of, well, yep, you stop your medication, but we'd love to see you again in 2 weeks' time. Most of the patients are just sick to death of coming to see us. So that's where telehealth approaches may be useful. The other thing that this data tells us, though, is that it's really quite simple for patients to miss a dose of long-acting injectable and go for weeks without having much in the way of withdrawal severity, which may lead them to sort of thinking, well, I could just stop treatment now, like I don't need it anymore. And that's a concern, because we know what happens when most patients just suddenly stop treatment. They will resume use of illicit opiates. So we need to get better at talking to our patients around the issues of stopping medication. What happens when you miss your doses, and you might be feeling just fine for 6, 7 or 8 weeks, but it doesn't necessarily mean that treatment, that you should be stopping treatment. And how do we connect patients better is something we need to be thinking about, I think, as treatment providers. And also, I think something we need to be thinking about also is how do we work with our patients and our consumer organisations to co-design these kinds of treatment approaches? Because we've been doing this for, 50 years, using opiate agonist treatment, and we treatment providers have largely ignored this issue. So maybe we can learn something from the patients who go through this, have had to experience stopping treatment without our support. So maybe we can learn from them what we should be doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Terrific talk. We are running late, and so we're. If people have questions for Dr. Lintzeris, I think after our final speaker would be fine. That would be the best bet. Our final speaker is Dr. Kenneth LEE, who is on Zoom. He is coming to us from London, Canada, and will be speaking about concrete experience in Canada with Sublocade, another injectable buprenorphine product. There he is.
Hi, thank you very much. Just want to make sure my slides are up and I can see my slides are up. So I will. Okay.
We don't hear you.
Oh, you cannot hear me? Okay. Let me just check that.
Yeah.
I am unmuted. I am unmuted right now. So it's something on your end, I think. So if you could make a little adjustment. Let me know when you can.
Try again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you very much for this invitation to Biarritz, France. I would be very happy to be there in person, but I can't be there, unfortunately. I'll tell you a little bit about our experience with buprenorphine long-acting in Canada. This is where our clinic is located, in London, Ontario, Canada, so Little London, in that red dot on the Google map there. And our clinic is located within a mental health clinic, and that's us in London, Ontario. And what's interesting is a lot of the observations the other speakers have made, Alice and Nicholas, are very similar to our findings with the alternate product. So in Canada, we do not have access to Buvidal. So our only access to a long-acting product of buprenorphine is Sublocade. So I'll refer to it as Sublocade. These are my conflicts of interest. I have been a speaker for Indivior and Master Clinician Alliance, mostly about buprenorphine and buprenorphine long-acting. And so this is most impactful in Canada is fentanyl. So what we're seeing in Canada is an opiate crisis with fentanyl. We see very little heroin. We do see some other prescription opiate addictions, but our main problem in Canada is with fentanyl. And when you look at Canada as a whole, this is the darker the color is, the worse the overdose rates are. So Western Canada have the highest opiate-related deaths that we see, and this is from January to September 2024. So this is just a partial year of 2024, last year. And so a lot of the opiates we see in Canada, I'll speak mainly about fentanyl, are contaminated with other substances, mainly benzodiazepines and alpha agonists like xylazine. So we see a lot of contamination with bromazolam. About 50% of our fentanyl samples are contaminated with bromazolam, which complicates our treatment, right? Because people will be withdrawing from benzos as well as withdrawing from opioids as well. So we have to keep that in consideration. With regards to the alpha agonists, we're seeing xylazine, which is a veterinary sedative that veterinarians use in animal surgery. They have a reversing agent called atipamezole. We do not have that in Canada. The comparable medication to xylazine would be clonidine. Now we're seeing substances like dexmedetomidine, which is an IV form of a human alpha agonist, mainly used in anesthesia during surgery. And now we're seeing carfentanil. And when you look at these samples, you can see other fentanyl analogs as well. So we will see acetylfentanyl, parafluorofentanyl, and various other analogs, which can be more potent or less potent than fentanyl. So longer acting or shorter acting. So we'll keep that in mind, these other syndromes as well, and other contaminants and variable potency of fentanyl. The current OUD treatments, opiate use disorder treatments available in Canada, are very similar to what you have in France. So we have methadone, we have buprenorphine naloxone. We do not have Subutex. Our product is called Suboxone, and this is a combination of buprenorphine and naloxone, to be explained at another time. Tablets and film, and we have buprenorphine monthly injections, BAP, but we only have available Sublocade in Canada. The other options are opiate replacements with a slow-release oral morphine, SROM, or Cadian, as it's termed in Canada, safe supply or replacement with hydromorphone, injectable OAT with hydromorphone or heroin, and various fentanyl products, patches, powders, and tablets. So keeping that all in consideration, we are faced with this decision tree in Canada. And so when we looked at the retention data with our Sublocade, patients on Sublocade, it's very similar to what Alice found in France with Buvidal. Our 6-month retention rate is about 60–70%. So knowing that, and we know that any opiate agonist treatment is better than no OAT at all, meaning anybody on any type of treatment, whether it's methadone, whether it's on low-dose buprenorphine or high-dose buprenorphine, any OAT is better than no OAT in terms of overdose protection. And so we divide patients at the London RAM clinic, our clinic, into these 4 broad groups. And patients will more likely stay in the treatment that they agree to stay on and what matches their treatment goals. And so the group A patients are patients that still want to use fentanyl, have no interest in cutting down, but perhaps they want to cut down a little bit and not have to look for fentanyl every day. The group A patients may be directed towards safe supply, slow-release oral morphine, or basically replacement with a prescribed opioid as opposed to the street fentanyl or in your case, heroin. The group B patients are patients who are a little bit more committed to decreasing their fentanyl use, but they still want to use fentanyl, but they don't want to plan when to use fentanyl. And so methadone being a full agonist with no blockade action, people can use fentanyl whenever they want. And so they perhaps want to stay on a dose of methadone to keep the daily withdrawal cravings in the morning, control the cravings in the mornings, so they don't have to go score, as they call it in Canada, street drugs right away. It gives them some time to plan. But they don't want to plan when they use fentanyl. They can use fentanyl whenever they want. We have divided the buprenorphine group into two groups, the low-dose buprenorphine group, which is tablets and film, and the high-dose buprenorphine group, which is the long-acting injectable. And again, we have Sublocade, which is a significantly higher dose than Buvidal. And so the low-dose buprenorphine patients are patients who want to use fentanyl occasionally, but they need to plan when they use. So patients know that if they stop their buprenorphine tablets or film for 2 days, they can go ahead and smoke some fentanyl and still get a high, not as good of a high as they would normally get, but they still can get a high. And they know that as long as they start their buprenorphine tablets, again, within 5 days, they don't get precipitated withdrawal. The group D patients are patients who are okay with euphoric blockade. They want to stop fentanyl. And by a secondary benefit, they get overdose protection. So when we first started using Sublocade back in 2019, we noticed that there were dropouts in the first 2 months. And when we questioned these patients later on why they dropped out, it was because they couldn't get high anymore on the fentanyl they were using. So similarly, in the Buvidal study in France, your dropout rate was highest in the first 2 months. And when we questioned these people, they told us that they could no longer get high when they were smoking fentanyl. And so we knew that there was euphoric blockade with high-dose buprenorphine monthly injection. But we also observed that the overdose rates were down significantly in the high-dose buprenorphine group. So more on that in a few minutes. And so I'm going to go over some of the differences between Sublocade versus Buvidal. And basically, Sublocade is a subcutaneous injection into the fat layer of the abdomen. And it's liquid in the syringe, but it solidifies on contact with bodily fluids, and it forms a depot. The chemical reaction where it goes from liquid to a gel is painful because it is an exothermic reaction, and the pain starts at about 10 seconds. We do the injection quickly so that the needle is removed before 10 seconds, so the reaction is occurring when the needle is out. And so we mitigate that by pre-cooling the injection site with an ice pack, and then immediately following the injection, we put the ice pack back on. The subcutaneous gel depot releases buprenorphine over a long time. It actually releases it over about 12 months. But the levels are therapeutic if you give it monthly. And so gradually this nodule is palpable in the abdomen and gradually decreases in size in time as the atrogel component biodegrades and releases buprenorphine. And then we simply rotate the injection sites to various sites in the abdomen. That being said, in Canada, it's a controlled delivery system directly from the pharmacy. Directly from the pharmacy.
La régie.
So there's no patient handling of the medication. Is everything okay over there? Okay. It is stored in a cold chain when it's delivered from the pharmacy to the clinic, but once it's in the clinic and you prepare it for injection, it can be left at room temperature for 28 days after removal from refrigeration. And so the product monograph indicates the following. Patients need to be on a steady dose of buprenorphine tablets for 7 days, between 8 and 24, at least 8 milligrams for 7 days. And the monthly injections are given every 26 to 42 days, meaning they can be 2 days early or 14 days late. And the administration is by a doctor, nurse practitioner, nurse, or a pharmacist. And you simply remove it out of the fridge for about 15 minutes before injection, and then you can go ahead and give the injection. So the recommendation is 2 300 milligram doses for the first 2 months, and then dropping down to 100 milligrams every 28 days. However, we have modified that in our studies to show we have clinically shown that it's more beneficial for fentanyl users and people with a past opiate overdose to keep them at the higher 300 milligram monthly dose. Delays of Sublocade injections don't have any clinically significant impact. In the past, we used to give a test dose of 8 milligrams if they were more than 2 weeks late, but we have learned that that's not necessary.
Ça marche plus.
And I will show you a little bit more. I was going to show a video of me giving an injection, but basically I'll skip that for the sake of time. But that's where you give it, is in the belly. The patient can be lying or sitting when you give the injection. And so we noticed early on that the patients on Sublocade were not overdosing as frequently as patients who were on methadone or on Suboxone. And so we did this paper back in 2020, 21 during COVID, real-world evidence for the impact of opiate agonist therapy on non-fatal overdoses in patients with opiate use disorder. And to summarize the data, I've skipped a lot of the study details for sake of time. But basically, we had 350 patients, 330 patients in 9 centers across Canada, Ontario, and BC. And we compared the overdose rates in patients on Suboxone versus on Sublocade, and methadone versus Sublocade. So look at the top line there in the red squares. The patients on Suboxone, buprenorphine, were 17.3 times more likely to have an overdose event in the 6 months of follow-up compared to patients on Sublocade. And when you looked at the methadone patients, they were 22.4 times more likely to have an overdose event. And this made sense as what we observed clinically with Sublocade. The one overdose that we did see in the Sublocade group was on a patient on the lower dose of Sublocade 100. The details of the study are in that paper, and it's open access. It's in the Journal of Addiction Medicine. And so what's interesting about our observations, this study from Leiden University came out at the same time our paper came out. And this is a study in the Netherlands where they had healthy volunteers, and they looked at patients' different effects of different doses of fentanyl on respiratory depression versus on the x-axis, the buprenorphine concentration. Details we can discuss at another time, but basically the findings were, if you look at the y-axis probability of apnea, which is a marker for overdose, even at the highest doses of fentanyl at 5 micrograms per kilo, when you were at buprenorphine concentrations of 5 nanograms per ml, you had very little effect on apnea, i.e., that is overdose protection. So just by way of comparison, the dosing for procedural anesthesia is 1 microgram per kilogram, for example, for getting colonoscopy or endoscopy. And so this is numbers out of Australia. These are plasma levels of the 4 different products that are out there right now: Subutex, Sublocade, Buvidal weekly, and Buvidal monthly. And so the comparisons are, when you look at the Suboxone plasma levels, there's a wide variability between the various Subutex doses, 8, 12, 16, and 24 milligrams. The number in the middle is the average plasma concentration. The number at the bottom is the C-min before the next dose was given. When you look at Sublocade, the second box, there's the variability in plasma concentrations. But you note at the 300 milligram Sublocade level, the C-min is above 5.0. Which is above the threshold of respiratory depression as per the Netherlands study. And so that's where we observed that patients were getting overdose protection and euphoric blockade from fentanyl with Sublocade 300. When you look at the lower dose of Sublocade 100, the plasma levels are about 1/3 or half, about half of what Sublocade 300 is, even though the dose is of Sublocade 300 is 3 times the dose of the Sublocade 100. Compare that to Buvidal weekly at the 8, 16, 24, 32 milligrams doses, and there's the plasma level. So they're lower than Sublocade 300, more in the range of a Sublocade 100. When you look at the monthly injection, you can see the very wide variation in plasma levels in the Buvidal 128. And so that explains why some people do very well on Buvidal 128, and some are oversedated, and for some it's not enough. So keep these plasma levels in mind when you consider the different options. We published this paper in Substance Abuse and Rehabilitation with our doing a literature review and our experience with the initiation and dosing of extended release of buprenorphine, a narrative review of emerging approaches for patients who use fentanyl. This is open access as well, and you can get this online as well. But basically, just to summarize a few points from that paper and some data from Indivior, and this concurs with Nicolas's observations about cessation of Buvidal and Sublocade. So when you look at the top graph, which is Sublocade 100, which is 2 300 milligram doses followed by the 100 milligram maintenance, versus the bottom graph, which is 300 milligrams continuously, after the last injection of 100, it takes about 2 months before the plasma levels drop to 2 nanograms per ml. And typically that's when we observe clinically that people get some withdrawal symptoms, very similar to what Nicolas is seeing in Australia. With a Sublocade 300, you're seeing the drop to 2 nanograms per ml not until 5 months. And so that's when you start to see the withdrawals. And what's interesting about this is because with our auto-induction observations that we've seen, when people are late for their Sublocade shots, if you can feel a nodule in their abdomen and you can see a positive buprenorphine in their point of care urine drug test, you can go ahead and give your Sublocade without fear or risk of precipitated withdrawal. So, which is good to know. The Sublocade product monograph indicates that you have to give they recommend that you give the shots every 28 days, plus or minus time frame, 2 days early or 14 days late. But for practical reasons, we have developed this accelerated loading dose of Sublocade, dose stacking as we term it, to get to a protective level quickly. And so we'll give the first dose of Sublocade 300 milligrams, and the second dose of 300 milligrams is given 1 to 2 weeks later. So we ask the patients to come in for their Sublocade shot when they experience withdrawal symptoms. Sublocade number 3, we give 2 to 3 weeks after the second injection, and the fourth injection is at 4 weeks after the third shot. And thereafter, the patients are asked to come in every 4 weeks, but they don't come in every 4 weeks. They'll start coming in 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks. And we have a couple patients that only get an injection every 12 weeks, and they're doing fine. Again, the retention rate is a little bit better with the accelerated dose stacking loading doses to try to get to that Cmin of 5 nanograms per ml. But the retention rate overall, when you look at all the data, is about 60% at 6 months, and very similar at about 12 months as well, because the patients who make it to 6 months usually make it to 12 months. And so we do have some patients getting their Sublocade shots every 12 weeks, so they're only getting 4 shots a year. Just to understand the idea of our auto-induction technique, we just look at, when you look at this, the precipitated withdrawal zone, when you're doing your buprenorphine inductions, the maximum displacement occurs at between buprenorphine 2 and 8 milligrams when you're using tablets or film. And so when you're microdosing, you're trying to make that peak less high, or when you're macrodosing, you're just avoiding the whole peak at all and doing it all at once. And so the microdose induction is the Bernese method from Robert Hemig in Bern, Switzerland. And we use this mainly for patients who are converting from methadone or prescribed opioids. And these are some of our protocols that we're using. It is fairly straightforward, as Nicolas indicated, to convert someone from a low-dose methadone to buprenorphine and then to Sublocade. We have converted patients from much higher doses, from probably about 170, 180 milligrams of methadone. Takes a lot longer with the microdosing, and we have converted those people to Sublocade as well. So some people on methadone choose to go to Sublocade to taper off opiate agonist treatment. We do our inductions fairly quickly in London. If patients present high and a no withdrawal, we do a home induction with buprenorphine. We give them 2 milligram tabs, 12 tablets to take home, and they do their own cows or sows withdrawal. And when they feel sufficient withdrawal, we tell them to take their buprenorphine 2 milligrams every hour until they've done the whole 12 tablets, come back to the clinic the next day, and we can give them a Sublocade injection at that time. So we do it much quicker than the product monograph indicates. And we educate the patient on the risk of precipitated withdrawal, and if that occurs, we manage it with, they take 4 tablets of the buprenorphine, or what they simply do on their own, is to smoke some fentanyl. Smoking some fentanyl is a very good treatment for precipitated withdrawal. The other option is the macrodose induction. This is the California Bridge protocol developed in California. High-dose buprenorphine induction, doing it very, very quickly. There's also the rapid induction with Sublocade study as well. But basically, with a macrodose induction, it's an alternative approach. You're trying to achieve a therapeutic dose very quickly on day 1. Usually, you can do this if their cow score is 8. And again, as Nicolas indicated, it's the objective signs of the cows that are more important. You can see pupillary dilation. You can see some sweating. You can see their eyes are moist. They may be vomiting. Just to see the objective symptoms. The subjective symptoms of the cows is very, very unreliable and not necessarily reproducible from one observer to the next. And so what we do is we give 16 milligrams of buprenorphine film, reassess in 1 hour. We give another 8 milligrams if needed. There will always be some withdrawal symptoms. And then we go ahead and give them a dose of Sublocade an hour after we've done this macro induction. The newest thing we're doing now is the Sublocade auto-induction. And so this is a strategy for very high tolerant fentanyl users at very high risk of opiate overdose. We've done this about 50 times now. They have failed other induction techniques, refuses that would do a macro induction in clinic. We know that they've been previously exposed to buprenorphine, so we know they tolerate the molecule. So we usually require a COWS of at least 7, meaning objective signs of COWS. So not the subjective symptoms where, I just don't feel well, my joints are achy. Usually the last fentanyl use is about more like 12 hours. 6 hours is a bit short. And then we give the buprenorphine, the Sublocade injection, without a Suboxone induction. And so this is our newest technique. So we know that we can do these auto inductions. And so therefore, a late Sublocade dose is very similar to an auto induction as well. So more on this later. I have shortened the presentation because of our time limitations, and I'm happy to turn this over to the conference moderator, and we can take questions from this point.
Thank you. Yeah, if we would, any questions for Dr. Lee?
We've treated about 2,000 patients with Sublocade since 2019. So this is our clinical experience.
Seeing none, thank you everyone for your attention. We had some pretty interesting talks here today, and appreciate people staying a little bit over time for it. So have a good evening. Running a study